So we know what carbon footprints are and what units we use. How do we actually go about measuring them? Let's take a look. So we know what a carbon footprint is and we know what units are used to measure a carbon footprint, but how do we actually go about calculating it? Well, it turns out the best way is to use a series of things called carbon factors, okay? And there's lots and lots of carbon factors. And the carbon factor is kind of a lookup table. It says, if you do this or if you burn that, you're going to emit that much carbon. And they cover many different things, and I'll go on to give you some examples a bit later. But a nice simple one for you is if you burn in your car 1 litre of diesel, then you're going to emit into the atmosphere 2.7 kg CO2e. If you remember that E means that's the equivalent of 2.7 tons of CO2. Kilograms of CO2. So 1 litre of diesel is 2.7 kilograms of CO2. And that's how we work it out. All we need to do for, let's take a journey say from Oxford to Edinburgh, is figure out how much fuel we used in that journey, and therefore multiply it by the carbon factor of 2.7, and that will give us the total carbon footprint. So if I run through that example with you, maybe you can see what I mean, okay? So let's have a look. Let's imagine that we do that journey from Oxford to Edinburgh, which is 367 miles, and let's assume my car does 36 miles to the gallon, okay? Gallon, by the way, is 4.55 litres. Okay, everything's in kilograms. I don't know about other countries in the world, but in this country, in the UK, everything's in a mix of imperial and metric measurements. So I've got 36 miles per gallon, and then the carbon factor per kilogram. Never made sense to me, but there you go. So you've got 36 miles per gallon, and there's 4.55 litres per gallon. So to figure out how much fuel we use, we divide the distance by the miles per gallon, and then put that into litres. So that would be 367 divided by 36 by 4.55. So we're going to use, or estimated, a use of 46 litres of petrol or diesel for that journey from Oxford to Edinburgh, okay? Let's imagine along the way that we had a chocolate bar. And so we can use the lookup table online, a different lookup table that says that each chocolate bar is 0.2 kilograms of CO2. And so if we want to figure out the carbon footprint of journey from Oxford to Edinburgh, where I stopped and had, say, 2 chocolate bars. I know, I need to lose a bit, but there you go. That means that the total footprint for that would be the footprint of the petrol plus the footprint of the chocolate bars. So 46 litres at 2.7 kilograms of CO2 per litre gives us 124 kilograms for the fuel. Then we've got 2 times 0.2 kilograms, which is 0.4 kilograms, giving us a total of 124.4 kg CO2 for that journey. And a kilogram of CO2 is just a thousandth of a ton. So 124.4 kilograms of CO2 is 0.1244 tons of CO2. Okay, and that would be what we write down as the amount of carbon emitted from Oxford to Edinburgh. If we look at applying this to our business, then what we do is exactly the same thing. We look at what the business does, we define the different activities, then we use these carbon factors to apply the carbon factor to that activity that the business does to give you a series of numbers which you then add up, and that's the carbon footprint of the business. Typically in net zero, we add up the carbon footprint of electricity, gas, fuel, that's diesel and petrol. And then from there, we add on things like waste, deliveries in, deliveries out, supply chain, commuting, and all the business travel you do. And that's kind of, that list is a predefined list that people in net zero land, we just use that list, okay? If you're following other standards, then they might have a slightly different list of things for that. Each one of the things I've just read out has got conversion factors associated with it. So for example, electricity has got each kilowatt hour of electricity in the UK in 2023 will generate so-and-so, emit or either so much CO2. each unit of gas, each kilowatt hour of gas will emit such and such, each kilogram of waste or each ton of waste will produce such and such, each as business travel, for example, each flight from A to B, business class or economy return will generate such and such. There's tables and tables and tables of these things, okay? If you want to find these tables, you can look online. If you just search for example, CO2 emissions for, I don't know, just put in whatever you're looking for, you'll find them. But governments also produce them. So, the UK government has got a spreadsheet with lots of different tabs along the bottom that has got all these all written down. So if you want an officially recognised sort of calculation, you can use the government factors to plug into your calculations there. Okay, so that's kind of the basic theory of them. Let's just see what types of factor there actually are. So what types of carbon factor exist out there? Well, there's a range of carbon factors, and they're produced, as I say, by governments, research bodies, independent trade groups, and some companies even produce their own as well. So, you might find a situation where you look up the carbon factor of X, Y, Z, and do you know what? You get different answers depending on who you ask. That's just a fact of life, I'm afraid. But broadly, in my book, Net Zero for Business, and if you ever want to buy that book, please do. It's available on Amazon. If you give it a glowing review, I'll love you forever and a day. So Net Zero for Business, available on Amazon. But in my book, I split them into 6 basic categories, okay? And the 6 categories have got different uses depending on what you're trying to do. The first one is rough estimates, then industry averages, supplier-based, activity-based, material-based, and then product-based. So there's kind of different ways of thinking about what a carbon factor is and how to use it. The simplest is a rough estimate. Okay, these are probably the least accurate. They're certainly extremely fast to use, but as a rough estimate to get you going, they're pretty good. All right, so you can actually say, for example, that if you had a school, and I think this is an example from the book, so let me just look up and see if I've got the exact numbers in here. I don't put it actually in the book, but if you've got a school, you could actually look up a factor of saying how much carbon there is emitted per pupil generally, in the UK. And let's say, for example, that's 3.8 tons of CO2 per pupil per year. Then a rough estimate basis, well, look, if I've got 100 pupils, then 3.8 times 100 will give you sort of 380 tons of CO2 as an estimate for your school. It's hugely inaccurate because you might imagine schools vary. Is it a primary school, secondary school? Is it like a college, which has just been grouped into schools? Is it a boarding school, a non-boarding school? Is it a school set in sprawling grounds with very light touch, or is it an intense? So there's so many different factors. But what they can do, these rough estimates, is give you a good handle, a good starting point. So you can say, look, we know it's not right, but it's going to be 380 plus or minus, say, plus or minus 50%, plus or minus even sort of 70 or 80%. They're very inaccurate, but at least it means you're in the realms of 380. You're not in the realms, for example, of 3,800 or 38,000, etc., etc. So rough estimates, as I say, have a look online. Just search for how much CO2 is emitted per student, etc., and you kind of get answers to things like that. The next sort of category are more accurate than that. They're called industry averages, and the posh name for them is EEIO, or Extended Economic Input Outputs. It's a bit of a mouth, wasn't it? But EEIO. And EEIOs are a series of factors that researchers have put together that says, in this industry, so for example, accounting, if you spent X pounds, then you're typically going to emit so much carbon based on that expenditure. So it relates expenditure back to carbon emissions. And you can use them, for example, to say I spent, I don't know, for example, £12,400 on accountancy services. Look up the factor of accountancy. 12,400 times that carbon factor gives you that emission value. They are used a lot to get a better, quick and dirty estimate of your carbon footprint than using the rough estimate method, but they're still pretty ropey. And if you just take accountants, what are you talking about? You're talking about an accountant who works from home, who has a very low carbon footprint, or one of the big swanky London ones that, seems to take you out for lunch every now and again, and guess who pays for that? But which type of accountancy is it? They don't make that distinction, so you've just got the one figure for, accountancy. The next one up from that, and now we start getting into the ones that I think are probably good enough to use in sort of real calculations, not just the rough estimates, not just sort of guesses and trying to frame it, but if you come to actually use them in anger, are supplier-based carbon factors. And supplier-based carbon factors are the amount of carbon emitted by a company divided by its turnover. And they vary obviously from company to company. And if we go back to that example of an accountancy company, imagine that the accountant works at home. Imagine the accountant turns over, say, £100,000 a year, and let's say they emit 100 tons. Then you could say, the way the supplier-based factors work is that you've got 100 tons of CO2 divided by 100,000 pounds. Therefore, each £1,000 generates 1 ton of CO2. So if, for example, you used half of that accountant's services, if you use 50% of his services on an annual basis, you are responsible for 50% of his CO2. So 50 times 1 ton is 50 tons of CO2. So you work out your spend with each supplier, then multiply that by their total carbon divided by their revenue. Okay? And that system is better because it then starts, instead of saying, we spent, for example, £12,400 on accounting, we could actually say we spent £12,400 with this company, and therefore, do the maths and you can see what proportion of their carbon footprint you are responsible for. Supplier-based metrics are, again, they're pretty fast to use. They're not hugely accurate. If you think about it, if you think that, for example, take company X that does two different things. Say it's got, for example, a part of the company manufactures bicycles and the other parts of the company gives consulting, then just because you spent £12,400 doesn't mean say you can attribute to that or that. It's got very different sort of, carbon emissions depending on what you're buying. And the supplier-based metrics don't take that into consideration. They group it all together in one blob. Okay, but they're pretty good and they're still used industry-wide for supply chain calculations. Okay, so that's where you'll find them and that's where they're the most useful. The next group of sort of carbon factors look at are activity-based carbon factors. And when you get down to this level, this is the approved system that is used for most calculations these days. Okay, so now we're definitely in the land of, yes, you can trust these. These are, the definitive version of what people use. And what they say is, if you do that, you will emit that. So, for example, the example I gave earlier, if you burn 1 litre of diesel, you will emit 2.7 kilograms of CO2, and with E tacked on the end there. So there's a long list of activity-based factors. Some of them are things like, if you burn X of fuel, then you'll sort of emit Y. Some are, if you travel X miles on a train, you will emit, carbon emissions of Y. Some say is if you do such and such short-haul flights, then you will emit such and such based on the length of the flight. Others are, for example, like waste. If you generate 3 tons of waste, then each ton of waste generates that, depending, of course, on what the waste type is. And there's tables and charts of all these things. So they're pretty good activity-based factors. They're probably the most widely used, with supplier ones sort of backing them up when we start talking about supply chain. The next level up from that is material-based, and now you start getting into the land of what's known as embodied carbon. And you could say, for example, we consumed 1 ton of aluminium. Therefore, do you know what? 1 ton of aluminium has got X tons of CO2 wrapped up inside it, or we consumed, or we used 1 ton of steel type 1 to 1 ton of steel type 2, etc, etc, etc. There's long lists saying if you have this material, then each ton of the material has this number of tons of CO2 in it. They are very useful for manufacturers. So if you're a manufacturer, you might want to use that material-based calculation to work out the carbon footprint of your sort of raw materials. And then you're allowed to split this into 2 and have, well, that's my materials, and here's my other activities, which we can use activity-based factors for. So you don't just have to choose one type of factor, you can mix and match. And as I say, manufacturers, this is what the raw materials consumed, this is what the rest of the business emitted, okay? The last one is product-based factors, sometimes known as LCA, life cycle carbon assessments, or EPDs, environmental product declarations. They're all the same thing, really. It's all about looking at what carbon was emitted in the production, use, and then disposal of this product. So say, for example, this pen, they look at the carbon that was used to produce the pen, the carbon emitted as I use the pen, 0, I suspect, and then the carbon emitted when I then get rid of the pen. Okay, and they wrap that up into a life cycle, the life cycle production, use, disposal, carbon figure for the pen. They're becoming a lot more popular now. There's a lot of activity going on LCAs, life cycle carbon assessments, all these product-based factors, especially in the construction industry, where they're becoming almost the norm. It's almost along the lines of if you want us to consider your material for use in building the house, you're going to need an EPD to sort of confirm how much carbon is in that product that we're looking at. EPD, by the way, is just an LCA, so life cycle carbon assessment. All the activity happens down LCA, life cycle carbon assessment. EPD is just like a rubber stamp on top of that, saying it meets certain standards, okay? So life cycle carbon assessments, that's what you should. So where should you use these factors, and how do you go about choosing between them? Because there's a large list to choose from. Quick rule of thumb, quick and dirty, industry average gives you a nice estimate, a quick estimate about what's going on, quite like that. They're very fast to use, not very accurate. Most people would use some form of activity-based costing with supplier-based analysis for their supply chain. That's the norm. With manufacturers and maybe resellers, or people who sort of take in anything and then supply it on, using a mixture of activity-based and either product-based or material-based, okay? And don't be frightened about mixing and matching between them, and certainly don't be frightened about writing 2 carbon footprints down if you want to say, our overall footprint is this, combined of this is the embodied carbon of the stuff we use, and this is the carbon emitted by the activities that we carry out. So you can have 2, and I think we went through that in a previous video with Heathrow Airport Week. So this is the air operations, largely that's the aviation fuel, and here's the stuff we're in more control of, which is what goes on within our airports. In terms of the factors themselves, they're always updated. It's a constant battle to keep everything up to date and to use the latest research, latest figures. And you can do this by hand, but if you're using any sort of software package, one of the big benefits there is they're always up to date. So the software vendors keep these things up to date, so the calculations you do, you're going to be accurate. Quite a long video. I hope that was useful. I hope you got stuck with me to the end. How do we work out carbon footprints? We split the carbon footprint problem into different sections, and then we apply carbon factors to work out the carbon footprint of each of those factors. Then we add them all up, okay? 6 different types of carbon factor: rough estimates, industry average, supplier-based, activity-based, material-based, and product-based. And you're allowed to mix and match those to give you a useful answer that you can do something about. Because obviously once you know your carbon footprint, the next challenge is to reduce it down. Okay, hope that was useful. Please feel free to check out my book, Net Zero for Business, Amazon, as I say. And if you feel like giving it a great review, I'd love that. That'd be fantastic. All right, see you next time.